Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Civic Life Lunch called Amplified Justice with Bonnie Gordon. My name is Sophia Kakoza, and I'm a second-year Master's in Musicology student here at Tufts. I'm so excited to be kicking off today's events. We are grateful for the support of our wonderful co-host today, the Tufts University Music Department. It is through meaningful collaboration with partners from across the university that we can bring events like this to you all. Tisch College has many events still to come this spring, including a virtual conversation tomorrow afternoon at 12 p.m. on what's going on with America's school boards. You can find more information and register for the event and other upcoming opportunities by visiting Tisch College website, tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. For folks in the audience, we'll have audience Q&A later in the program, so please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen at any time. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Bonnie Gordon. Dr. Gordon is the Faculty Director of Community Engaged Scholarship at the Equity Center at the University of Virginia, as well as the Associate Professor of Music within UVA's Music Department. The Equity Center, which Dr. Gordon was instrumental in founding, is UVA's new Democracy Initiative Center for the redress of inequality through community-engaged scholarship and collaboration. Dr. Gordon also co-directs the new Sound Justice Lab and directs the community-engaged curriculum in the college. A talented musician herself, Dr. Gordon plays viola in a free improvisation trio, Angela on the Arts, and in a rock band called Side Hustle. She is the author of several books, including her 2004 book, Monteverdi's Unruly Women, The Power of Song in Early Modern Italy, and Just in Press, Voice Machines, The Castrato, The Cat Piano, and Other Strange Sounds. Joining Dr. Gordon for the Q&A portion of this event will be Austin Fletcher Professor of Music and Dean of University College, Joseph Honor. Professor Honor has served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Musicological Society and general editor of Garland Routledge Studies in Contemporary Music and Culture. He is the recipient of fellowships from the J. Paul Getty Center for the History of Art and the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Professor Honor served as a former vice president of the American Musicological Society. Before coming to Tufts in 2006, he was associate provost at Stony Brook University. Dr. Gordon will give a presentation and then Professor Honor will join her on screen for audience Q&A. Please welcome Dr. Bonnie Gordon.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Thank you so much for having me. It's a treat to be here in this Zoom space in Joe's office. I am going to talk probably for around half an hour. And I should say, I'm going to start sharing my screen in a minute, but I should say it's actually, I think this might be the first time I've ever really given a talk around civic engagement. It's actually hard to figure out what to say. I think when you do this, it's a bit like being a musician. It's just the thing you do rather than the thing that you talk about, like air that you breathe. But what I'm going to do is talk about the three things that I've been the most connected with at UVA and the kinds of civic engagement work that I've done, which has really been about knitting together existing programs. And one is the Equity Center, of which I was on a team of 5 female faculty that founded it, and we're now sort of launched and we're all finishing our term, so it will continue to go without us. And then the Sound Justice, which is brand new and has just been funded by UVA's Democracy Initiative. And then I'm going to talk about a small program called the Arts Mentors, which I started many years ago, which has been kind of a model for civic engagement. So now I'm going to do the PowerPoint. Okay, go back. Make sure. So this, as I said, I have been a founding director of the Equity Center. And this emerged in the way that things often do at universities with a call for proposals. There was a call for an exploratory grant to get money to explore whether you wanted to make a pan-university institute or not. And this was in August of 2017, which was shortly after Charlottesville had been invaded by white supremacists. And a group of us that had been doing a lot of community work had in fact missed almost all of the calls for everything because we were too busy doing things. And in this case, we put ourselves in a room for 3 hours and decided to see what we could do. And we figured if we could get ourselves funded in 3 hours, we would do it. And if not, we would not. But we did. And I think the reason it worked is that, in fact, we'd all been doing a lot of work together and separately for about a decade. And what we said in our proposal, as I was looking, I haven't looked at this proposal in a couple of years, and I was surprised. In fact, we have done a lot of what we said. What we said is this proposal invites the University of Virginia to establish an institute for the redress of inequity through community engaged scholarship. Ultimately, the fundamental changes and research models proposed by the Equity Institute will influence the university's operations. In sum, the Equity Institute will amplify and support what President Ryan has identified as the core purpose of the university: to serve. Indeed, the Equity Institute will provide the essential infrastructure for the University of Virginia to answer the president's call to be an institution with a heart and a soul. And we really wanted to be a national model for how to think about community engaged scholarship and curriculum in a public research institution. And part of this was in an answer to the fact that we have so often been ground zero for white supremacy in Virginia over and over and over again, arguably for reckoning with the chattel slave system and its inextricable intertwining with the fantasy of democracy. The 1619 Project made front page news of it. American origin stories have tended to highlight Jamestown in Virginia as the first English settlement and as the birth of American democracy. And this is every kid in Virginia. We take Virginia history 3 times in Virginia. It's quite excessive. Sylvia Winter, however, says in the Black August of 1619, the Virginia Company purchased 20 abducted Africans. They created new laws permitting land held in common to become individualized private property for previously indentured white servants. Thus, Jamestown was sustained by a plantation triad: the invention of Black people as property, the invention of indigenous land as claimable private property, and the invention of white people as property owners. So we also were committed to the idea that not only were we a university in Virginia, but we're a public research university in Virginia. And we felt that public universities bear a particular responsibility. We're a public resource with a public mission. Public universities produce important cutting edge knowledge and technology that should translate into pragmatic solutions to increase social equity. By working with their community partners, research universities can help build civic capacity and agency that communities need to take charge of significantly and sustainable disrupting cycles of inequity. Based on our existing success, the University of Virginia is poised to become a national leader in community engaged research aimed at achieving social justice. That's one of the things we wrote. And like so many university towns, Charlottesville is home to vast inequities. And like with so many university towns, it's arguably in some ways the fault of long-standing extractive practices, in our case, beginning with the fact that it was built by slave labor. But Charlottesville is not alone in suffering from these acute disparities. Many of the cities and towns where social economic inequities flourish are also home to some of the nation's most progressive research universities. Approximately 1/3 of the 25 school districts in America with the widest achievement disparities between Black and white students are located in or near college research towns. Indeed, it is a common and perverse feature of university towns across America that universities in places like Chapel Hill, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Berkeley, New Haven, Mississippi exacerbate rather than remediate such inequities. The fact that college towns like these regularly top the best places to live only make the contrast with the data around disparate social outcomes in those places all the more bracing. And what we've done in the Equity Center, it's been, I think, in the end, I think I will look at this as one of the most exciting things I've done, in part because I come from a field that's not a collaborative field, and this is something that we've really built together as a team. So one of the things we did was to help various arms of the university come up with a kind of mission for sustainable community partnerships. And this was also part of the university's strategic plan. I think it's like the 2030 plan about sustainable community, but we drafted these sort of principles with a group of community partners. And in some ways they sound a little bit, perhaps almost trite, like anyone could write them. But on the other hand, if you think of them as a thing that people really adhere to, they do some work. So practicing humility, institutional culture, and interpersonal humility, pursuing mutual benefits, so identifying community and institutional assets and committing to equitable outcomes, and building authentic partnerships to co-create transparent, accountable, and collaborative work. And as you can imagine, the accountability is, of course, the hardest part. And we've been working for the last couple of years to come up with some both quantitative and qualitative rubrics for accountability. Another thing that we've done, and this was sort of gifted to, this was sort of part of the deal we made with the president when the equity started, was that we would have community fellows. And this is modeled on, I think at Yale, it's called the Good Neighbors program, or Neighborhood Neighbors in Residence. It's modeled on that. And what we've done is we now have our third core cohort of community fellows who basically we put out a call for applications, and community leaders, organizers, activists, artists apply for funding, which is, we're the fiscal home for the funding, but we also mentor people through projects. So this was a cohort last year, and we had a group that was working with African-American women in doulas and birth circles. We had a group working in the Latinx community on technology training and literacy for recent refugees. We had a woman who's been very, very active in legislation around mental health and incarceration. And we have new fellows this year, and I'm gonna mess up who's doing what, but the person that I'm working with the most closely is from the Monacan Nation, which is the land that UVA is on, and he's interested in digitizing their oral traditions, which are in their tribal museum, which is kind of an hour-ish from UVA. We have also been working towards youth pipeline programs, and we're just inaugurating something called the Star Hills Pathways program, which is going to be a kind of 7th grade to college program that's designed to offer pathways to college, not necessarily to UVA, but to college. And this is modeled on a program at Michigan. Our current Vice Provost for Equity and Diversity came from Michigan, and it was called the Michigan Wolverines. So it's not quite like theirs, but it's similar. And oh, this is the other one. And you'll notice that I said a lot modeled on. One of the things that has become, abundantly clear is that there's a lot of really good work being done in community engagement, both at UVA and around the country. And particularly in a humanities context, there's this desire to invent new things. You have to discover it and make it new. And it turns out that lots of people are already doing good work. So we've tried really hard to knit together existing programs locally and to look really carefully at what institutions that function like us are doing. And in our case, we're also a kind of complicated public-private. So we end up modeling ourselves, looking at what both public and private institutions do. So as part of the Equity Center, I've been a part of a project that was called Amplify Justice, and we have now just been made into the Sound Justice Lab. This is one of our students' first interventions. And so the Democracy Initiative has rotating labs, and we're the rotating lab for next year. So it will be it's a 3-year project, and I'm working with an ethnomusicologist named Nomi Dave and a law professor named Ann Coughlin. And Nomi was a human rights lawyer before she went to ethnomusicology grad school. So I'm basically, it's lawyers and me. And this project began really from a project that Nomi was doing with a graduate student of ours around a sexual violence trial in Guinea and the defamation lawsuits that came out of it. And we started thinking around ways to think about sexual violence with community, local partners locally and globally. And we worked together for a couple of years on a number of different initiatives that we began knitting together, in part through a class that Nomi and I have been co-teaching, and in part through some collaborations with the law school. So the Sound Justice Lab responds to 21st century global democratic crises and aspirations by exploring the limits, erasures, and gaps of formal legal systems and the popular and creative ways in which citizens respond to judicial and political failures. We attend to dissonances between failed narratives promulgated by legal texts on the one hand and the transformative social movements demanding justice on the other. In so doing, we recognize that democracy has always been improvisatory, creative, and noisy, whose voices are amplified and whose are silenced, how are voices circulated and how are they heard. And we are constantly asked how we will affect democracy and policy because we are in the democracy initiative, so we have spent a lot of time thinking about that. We're poised to contribute to the official practices that will condition the future of democracy and determine our commitment to the rule of law. The lab will inform work done by institutions and actors who are empowered to adjudicate competing justice claims and indeed to decide what counts as justice. The lab's impact will not be the sort that occurs when two distinct objects forcibly collide, leaving one destroyed and the other damaged. That is not what we have in mind, even though the lab forges together disciplines whose methodologies may seem at tension with one another. We expect people who hear about what we do to wonder, how can artists' work done in the studio, on the stage, on the page, in the street, shape the practical work performed in the courtroom, the judges' chambers, the legislative hall, or the business roundtable? Our answer is that, like art, law is a storytelling enterprise. It is as transformative as it is basic. Law's legitimacy relies on truth claims, and truth claims come in narrative form. The wisdom and justice of our law resides not in a compilation of rules, but in a collection of stories, and explains why claims for relief, some are upheld and others are not. These stories are sometimes particular ones associated with courtrooms and sometimes more general. A contemporary loss of faith in our political and legal system is overdetermined, but one crucial shortcoming inspired Black Lives Matter and Me Too. A law enforcement system is unjust when based on narratives that reflect the experiences of only one group. A democracy that rests on such narratives is bound to fail. Legal and political judgments embodied in jury verdicts, judicial pronouncements, legislative enactments, constitutional commitments, or the ballot box will be accepted as sound only if they emerge from robust negotiations among alternative accounts of the content and value of lived experiences. We do not, however, assign to art an unproblematic emancipatory role, nor suggest that its value can be reduced to the instrumental. We proceed from the premise that the humanities and allied practices offer access to experiences, perspectives, and norms that official narratives leave out. Our plan builds directly on the idea of the university as fundamental to shaping the creativity and improvisatory practices of democracy. We want to educate students to be citizens attentive to experience existing beyond the margins of their own lives. We want to create scholarship that enriches the stories that lawmakers and officials recount when deciding what and who counts as a danger, warranting violent intervention. Our impact will be constituted by measurable outcomes, policies, bills proposed, litigations pursued, legal judgments won or lost. And this we're working with one of our primary partners, and this is someone who works with Legal Aid Justice Center in Virginia, who's also a poet and is one of the primary advocates in the Virginia State Legislature, which has become increasingly tricky. And this is just in November, Sines v. Kessler was this landmark trial of white supremacists, and our students listened to the audio live stream and did a lot of work sort of getting information out about it, including, unbeknownst to us, painting this beta bridge where students sort of paint activist things, and they painted the thing telling local people to listen to the trial because the trial got, it was on the phone, so not Zoom, but it basically got Zoomed bombed by white supremacists. So the students were trying to, it worked actually to get hundreds of people to call and block them. So this is quite oriented at this point in two different directions. We're thinking in some, very much about a kind of theoretical underpinning. And then we have some small projects that we're knitting together around creative practice and around building trusts with the communities that we're working with. So this is a drum line that's been started with one of my graduate students in City of Promise, which is a neighborhood centered in a public housing neighborhood that is, if any of you were familiar with the Promise neighborhoods, it's Charlottesville's kind of equivalent of that. Charlottesville also is home to the IRC, the International Refugee Commission. So we get a lot of refugees, and we've had like 300 Afghan refugees in the last little while, and we've been organizing creative connections, particularly for women and children, that are leading towards getting 2 swimming pools to open just for women in the summer, as a way also to basically make sure kids learn to swim. And I should say, I didn't make most of these slides. So there's the ones that are fancy are way fancier than I've made, and there's probably more pictures of me than I would have picked. My introduction to doing community engagement was through a program called the Arts Mentors, which was, I was just looking, it was really a long time ago. And I suppose a lot of things happen because there's something to apply for, and one does. But it's also started when my kids were in 3rd grade. So I started it with my twins' 3rd grade teachers. And there was this program called the Mead Endowment, where music professors got $3,000 to do something, and music had to get one because he was a musicologist. And I said I wanted to do this thing of taking under-resourced kids to arts events, and they wrote back and said, we're not going to fund that because it doesn't help UVA students. And then I wrote back and said, okay, well, then I don't want your money. And then they realized they had to give it to me because they had to fund a music person, and everyone else had already been funded. So what we did was, in Charlottesville, kids are required to take an art in 5th and 6th grade, and they do orchestra, band, choir, or art. And what was abundantly clear was that, in effect, affluent white kids were in orchestra and band, and Black and brown kids were in choir or art wherever their guidance counselor stuck them, and that this was a lot around exposure and opportunity. So we built a program that targeted 3rd and 4th graders for exposure as a way to introduce them to the arts, so that when they began 5th grade, they would be able to choose with more intention, and just as a way to think really intentionally about equity in the arts. Like so many of these things, it seemed like it would be very easy, and it was not easy at all. So I ended up working with a friend of mine in the Dean of Students office, and we have a public service organization called Madison House, where 3,000 students do public service, and we sort of lent the program to them when I was on sabbatical, and now it lives there. And part of my impulse when I designed this with my friend who's now our Dean of Students was that we really wanted to design a program that would make it feasible for faculty and students to think very intentionally and deeply about community engagement in contexts outside of the nursing school and social work school, in ways that were going to build good citizens. And we wanted to really think about some of the mechanisms that prevent them from happening, many of which are sort of silly, like who can you write a check to? So this program, the pandemic in some ways paused it, but we have been able to be nimble, and the students, I mean, this has been way more the students than me, have really come up with some creative ways to engage while not giving people COVID. And they started at the beginning of the pandemic, they built creativity kits for like 300 kids. And then they also built the sort of art supplies for Freedom School in the summer. And they've kept doing that. And then we also, some of the music majors began working with sort of practice partners with local 5th and 6th graders on Zoom, because suddenly there was a 5th grade band teacher with 150 wind and brass players on Zoom. So the Arts Mentors has turned out to be, we kept it very small, and as a kind of model of high impact and high profile opportunities that can be a model. And we hoped that students would gain a humanities inflected civic engagement experience. And we did this by drawing on literature and methodology and programming from a lot of places. And we did use it ultimately as a model for a civic engagement curriculum in the College of Arts and Sciences, which is interdisciplinary classes that last for a whole year that are building around civic engagement, and are taught in disciplines. So if you teach it in music, it's community engagement in music. So for example, one of the first ones in that curriculum was a colleague in psychology who works with autistic adults, young adults who don't speak, and the students worked, it was called the Science and Lived Experience of Autism. And the neuroscience majors worked with autistic young adults around understanding the science behind it. And often, of course, the young adults were quite opposed to the science, and that was a great class. So these are some early pictures of it. I'll just end by saying to do this work in Virginia is the political act, whether we like it or not. We have a new governor who won because he promised to purge the schools of critical race theory, to ban Toni Morrison. In fact, his first act was an executive order that says this: by virtue of the authority vested in me as governor, I hereby issue this executive order to ensure excellence in K-12 public education in the Commonwealth by taking the first step on day one to end the use of inherently divisive concepts, including critical race theory, and to raise academic standards. So UVA sits on the cusp of the city of Charlottesville and the county of Albemarle, and the county is currently embedded in a lawsuit brought forth by the Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative Christian nonprofit, who they say they are targeting the pathological teaching that treats students differently based on race, and that is in direct conflict with the Supreme Court and the Virginia Constitution. And the thing that really kind of spun the governor to his unfortunate victory was started in this one particular situation where 10 years ago, a Northern Virginia kid was apparently disturbed reading Beloved. I've been teaching Toni Morrison every year since I moved back to Virginia. And almost everything she writes signifies the expression of Black interiority. And Beloved is a story that fills the space between memory and forgetting. It's exactly the kind of book we want our students to read. In the book, she uses slave narratives to do what she describes as things fugitives did not say. Her writing reverberates with exactly what we want our students to understand. Our new governor wants to erase this in favor of a curriculum modeled on the 1776 Commission, which was Trump's patriotic education program designed to purge schools of left-wing indoctrination. I would say Virginia never fails to surprise. So the last slide I have is just before the pandemic in February of 2020, a kindergarten classroom outside of Charlottesville made a poster based on one that had been created by a teacher in Mississippi. And it read, "Dear students, they didn't steal slaves. They stole scientists, doctors, architects, teachers, entrepreneurs, astronomers, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, and made them slaves. Sincerely, your ancestors." A local right-wing radio host posted a picture of the poster, and then an incredible brouhaha incurred with like all kinds of hostility, and the poster was eventually taken down because it was not bringing the Kale community together in the spirit of inclusivity and celebration, nor did it reflect the school's values of young people. The superintendent could not have been more wrong. So some of the kids we work with organized this event called Brave Space Black Excellence Poster Making Session, and they did all these posters. So on my left is one of the teachers who I started the arts mentors with, and one of the kids of the teacher. And then on the right, well, one of those is my kid, and one of those is the kid of the teacher. So I guess I'll close with that, with saying the kids have shown us the brave spaces even in Virginia.
Let's see. Good. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Thanks so much, Bonnie. So I'm Joe Honor. I'm, as you heard, a professor of music and dean of University College. And it's so great to have Bonnie here to do this talk. And we definitely want to talk about what she just said, but for those of you who don't know, Bonnie, is a very active scholar and writes on music in the 17th century, among other things, and all her research also circles around to these issues. All her research is politically engaged and engaging and deals with things in the real world all the time, no matter what she's writing about. So when she said it's kind of the air you breathe as a musician and scholar, at least the kind of musician and scholar that Bonnie is, it really does come out in everything she does. So it's really great to hear this work. And what we are doing now is, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A and let me know if you have any thoughts. Anyone yet? I've got a question for you, Bonnie. So, like how, I mean, Tufts has been deeply engaged over the last 2 years with, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, huge initiatives across the university, kind of a whole new infrastructure is created with, real, very impressive people, lots of major things. We did our first Juneteenth celebrations as an official university holiday. So there's a lot of kind of new energy in this space. And how has that impacted, I'm sure it's happening there as well, how has that impacted this project and the kind of work you do?
I mean, yeah, it's certainly the same thing for us and has been really for the last 5 years. I mean, UVA just got, or a couple of years ago, got a very large Mellon grant, a race, space, and place grant, which allowed for a number of racial justice hirings. We did a racial equity report. I think that the impact, on the one hand, one worries that things might be trendy. On the other hand, it's been a huge infusion of money, and there is a certain way in which, I mean, this stuff actually is really, really expensive to do well. So I would say at Virginia anyway, one of the biggest barriers had been previously a lack of kind of institutional and centralized support. There's really, there's plenty of bad actors in universities, but there's actually plenty of good actors and good ideas and good intentions. So I think the impact has been good. I mean, I'm always conscious of, Sarah Ahmed's work on diversity, where she says diversity is kind of just a way to cancel the people who don't agree with you. So I get, certainly I think it's also been a lot more committees for a lot of women and people of color. I mean, definitely, I don't know about here, but we've had an incredible upsurge of committees. But I think the balance is a plus, even though there's a lot more meetings.
Great. We have a few questions here. The first one is, can you share some examples of how to insert new voices in the narrative process of lawmaking?
Yeah, so I can tell you, it's kind of a super big question, and it's our central question. So, what you can do in the courtroom and what you can do in a policy hall are quite limited. In a courtroom, for example, like my colleague Anne likes to say, a court case is designed for, there's a winner and a loser, and everyone has a story to tell that fits it. And what we've been thinking about a lot, so that is, first of all, ideas about street justice. So we work with a group called the Buck Squad that has been a gun violence prevention on the streets, and do a lot of storytelling with them. And we've been working with them around youth programming for the summer. There's a program in Richmond called Performing Statistics that I'm the absolute wrong person to ask for this about this because I'm so unvisual, but it's very much about kind of creative visualizations of data. So you can say, 1 in 5 children in Charlottesville are food insecure, which leads to suspension, which leads to prison, but that doesn't really do very much. But if you can come up with a kind of creative way to perform it. We've also been working particularly with women and newly arrived refugee communities, also around storytelling, and our local radio station, which is it's kind of an old school college NPR radio station, has been running various like podcasts and things like that. But a lot of it is really in taking the stories outside of the courtroom. And outside of the policy. And, right now, I mean, certainly at a state level, the situation is dire. So I would say whatever we thought we might have done with anybody would have done is just quite different with this governor. But I mean, I never really thought that I'd understand this much about state politics, but there it is.
Great. Okay, here's the second question. I'm interested in whether or not you've developed professional development curriculum for elementary school educators based on your art program, and if that professional development is available for educators in school districts within or beyond Virginia.
So we have done some local PD. As I said, the program I started this with these two. My kids were in third grade at the time, and they had what turned out to be the dream team of third grade teachers. They were both right out of ed school and have turned out to be the most amazing teachers and thinkers on the planet. So we've done local PD. We have had some of our education grad students write some of it up. It's not, I would say, like, it's really not professionally recirculatable at this point. But we had to do it because it's Virginia. We had to do it in accordance with SOLs. And one of the things that I would say that was such an important sort of tool for us was to think about what in a project like this, what is it that practicing artists offer? What is it that classroom teachers offer, and what is it that students offer? And they all offer very different things. I think the thing that was one of the most important things to me has also been to compensate everyone for their time. Because I think that teachers and artists are both, it's like you should just maybe do this for fun on the weekend, offer a little bit more art to kids who can't get it when they pay for it. So we have done, come up with pretty rigorous scales for compensating, and also wanting to make sure, certainly in the arts, there's this free ticket fallacy that if you give free tickets to kids who wouldn't normally get to things, they'll just somehow appear. So that's been really important to us too, is thinking fiscally about what it actually takes to do this well.
And that question came from someone at the Tisch College, and they're very involved in, really operationalizing these ideas and building infrastructure to do those things. And and we're very lucky to have this kind of support. Okay, here's another one. Could you talk a bit more about how being part of these kinds of community engagement for justice and equity influenced students who are part of it? And how has this tighter, more insistent equity lens influenced other forms of community engagement, service learning, capstone course projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, as I said, one of the things that was really important this really goes back to my friend Julie and I, who started a lot of this together, was actually really thinking beyond. I mean, UVA has, I think when we started this, there was some amazing statistic, like 93% of UVA students were doing public service, but a lot of it was pretty crappy and unintentional. So really what we wanted to do was to think about ways to make it intentional. And I can say, we ran a couple of, not studies, but sort of pre and post surveys over the years. And certainly at the end of these various programs, we get more students that are interested in various kinds of civic engagement. And, you survey them 5 years later, and the ones that went to law school seem slightly more likely to be a public interest lawyer. I have to admit, the funders care about that. I'm somewhat less interested in that because I just feel like it's all so unpredictable. But I think what students seem to express is that it's made it somewhat more meaningful. So, and we've also been, pretty intentional about trainings, just because you just don't want students going out into these neighborhoods where they don't know the history. And in the case of Charlottesville, it has been actually quite a dangerous situation also. So you really need students to be dangerous from white supremacists. You really need students to be careful. And, the equity lens. So in some ways, I don't think it's necessarily narrower. I mean, there's some ways where equity is the new word for diversity, which was the new word for something else. So Yeah, I don't think it's narrowed it. I think I mean, one thing that in everything is there's always this risk of mission creep. And, one thing, I'm not very good at this because I kind of want to like fund everybody and help everyone do everything they want to do, but you can't do everything. So I would say in the Equity Center, I mean, particularly because it was coming from the president, we had these 4 kind of arms that were tied to strategic plans. So one was around, housing, one was around health equity, which obviously became especially important in the pandemic. One, I can't remember, and then one was pipeline programming. So I would say, sometimes the lens really helps just because you can't do everything.
Mm-hmm. This is a related question, and you may have answered it already, but it's said, I'd like to ask a practical question. How do you create the space so students can afford to be actively involved in the different activities you've mentioned? Do they get community work credit, or is it through set of courses that they take? And I think this relates to something we've talked about a lot. It's also creating space for faculty members to do this kind of work. It's the same kind of challenge.
Yeah.
Do you get credit? Do you get anything? But how do you make it possible for students? Yeah.
We do it in a number of ways. And in fact, when we first started the Arts Mentors, it was a bit of a, I mean, at that point, I was not interested in working with Madison House. They have had 3 new directors since then. And one of the problems with the public service arm at UVA was that it really was not feasible for athletes, artists, or anybody putting themselves through college because of the way it was done. So we, first of all, have worked on a number of programs with a number of different types of time constraints, and the athletes are a really big deal for us. And then, so sometimes it's course credit. I would say right now there's an enormous amount of tension around this question of paying. So in the Sound Justice Lab, I have 3 undergraduate interns who I'm sort of paying at the top of what I'm allowed to pay interns. But, I think we went from paying nobody to do anything to some people paying everybody to do everything. And that's probably not feasible or quite right, because I'm not certain that a first-year undergraduate music major helping a kid for 15 minutes really deserves the same price that my colleagues who are professional music teachers. So I would say that's a really, really hard question to answer, but course credit, and for depending on the program, certainly paying, and same for grad students. We have a lot of interns. One of the things we did at the Equity Center was we have this, like, I now have a handout that I could just email people, which is a community partner and student pay scale. And as Joe, suggested, I mean, the problem is it's equally vexed for faculty because none of this, like in my promotion file, this all goes as service. There's really no space for this in the college. There's, given the new hires, many of whom are coming in with the desire and expectation that to do this kind of work, I suspect the promotion and tenure structure will have to change. But yeah.
Good. Okay, here's another question. I strongly appreciate and agree the idea of taking control of the narrative by amplifying voices and stories. I run an art and storytelling initiative to address stigma surrounding the myriad of issues surrounding opioid use disorder, the Opioid Project, Changing Perceptions Through Art and Storytelling, where we pay art making with the spoken word. This is the question. Have you had success getting less like-minded people to listen and be open to the narrative through these kinds of projects?
So I think that the official answer would be yes, and I would say I'm not really sure. So there's, Virginia's really different than Massachusetts right now, I would say too, I think, one of the things is that not everyone who's interested in social justice actually agrees on everything. So within a kind of, social justice circle, there's actually often quite a lot of tension. I think I've seen some success in getting people to hear stories. And I think the idea is that a personal story will make someone less hostile. I think, in Virginia right now, it's not, it's pretty nasty and there's not a lot of that. but
Mhm.
it's a pretty particular time.
Yeah. This is a related question that follows. You talked about the current political situation in Virginia. In your opinion, what's the role of higher education institutions directly impacted by legislation to fight back or challenge it?
So that is a great question. And the interesting thing is that right now they're actually not targeting the institutions of higher learning. I mean, what happens in the K-12 system will come to the public universities. So also, I accidentally got elected to the AAUP, even though we don't even have a union in Virginia, but we're hosting a bunch of like panels and teach-ins with local K-12 educators and the African American Cultural Center, and really trying to make the particular UVA, Virginia doesn't have a flagship, but we sort of are a flagship institution. And it seems incredibly important, particularly for tenured people, to really, really have the backs of the K-12 system right now. And so one of the things that happened is one of the first things the governor did was like do a hotline where you could report teachers, and then people started flooding the hotline with stories about their teachers. So a lot of, I mean, I did this, but a lot of other faculty did this too. All of our students started flooding the hotline with messages, including faxes about their great Black History Month experiences in high school. But I think the role is, you know, right now, so they already fired the general counsel at UVA, and he was, I might add, you know, by my definition, not a radical. He is one of the lead attorneys on the January 6th report, and he had done the local report on August 11th and 12th. So the governor or the attorney general promptly fired him. Right now, none of us, we don't answer directly to the state legislature. We answer to the Board of Visitors, who's appointed by the state legislature. But I think the role is to very, very much keep doing what we're doing, and to continue to offer as much outreach and education as we can. But I mean, there's also been a real impulse, you know, people will say, oh, we need to get all these teachers to come talk. And I think we need to be really careful because they're under a different kind of scrutiny. But it's a great question. And I think sometimes when, you know, some of my colleagues seem less invested, it's easy. It's just, the strategic answer is they're going to come here next. You know, this is how it always goes. They go for K-12 and then they go to universities. They just haven't done it yet.
This is a related question. You know, could you talk about some of the challenges you yourself have faced engaging in music and politics? And I know you have had some more direct challenges that way.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, it's just always hard to, you know, it's hard to figure out what to do and what the right platform is. And I think, you know, conceptually I find these really deep intellectual challenges about what's the right thing to do and when does kind of engagement become its own colonial project, and you know, what is the right thing to, when a new assistant professor says they want, you know, a sort of like pragmatic institutional level, what happens when, you know, an assistant professor wants to do something and you want to say, well, that's such a great idea, but it's going to get in the way of your getting tenure. You know, certainly in Virginia, I mean, it's just, well, you just get like, you know, doxxed and just annoyed by white supremacists every so often. I think, yeah, and every time I write something, which is also super not, I mean, I love the idea that they think I'm radical, but I'm not. There's some like nasty person who, you know, stalkers and stuff, but it's mostly not scary. It's just annoying.
Mm-hmm. And I mentioned this at the start in terms of your own scholarly work, you managed to make it politically engaged no matter what you're writing about in various ways. Maybe could you talk about the newest project on Jamestown and that sort of work you're doing? Because I mean, it's not really separate or independent of your equity work, and it is this kind of air you breathe. And maybe you could talk about the scholarly air a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so this project was initially called Jefferson's Ear, but I've gotten a little bit sick of him. So I've been working on early Virginia, and actually along with 3 musicologists across the state. Emily Green at George Mason is really the leader on this. We have this statewide grant to think about the music of early Black Virginians. And this started really actually right when I got to UVA from Stony Brook, because I was writing this book I was trying to find a Handel aria in the library, and the only one they had was in Thomas Jefferson's collection. And I went to get it and they were like, you can't look at that. I was like, what do you mean I can't? I just need this aria. So anyway, I realized that we had all these Jefferson materials. But you know, it turned out that for me, I mean, a lot of the ways to think about Jamestown were so wrapped up in the kinds of research I was already doing, particularly because Virginia, I mean, the system of enslavement was so modeled on the Spanish colonial project. And I have really come to think about this idea of understanding the deep history as being important, not just for the telling of the story, but for as a way to kind of get out of it and to get out of the mess. And I also find that because of this weird thing, I think maybe Massachusetts is like this too. There's just so much state history, you can't believe it. And so for the students, it really does resonate because they have these things that they learned in 3rd grade, and they learned even sometimes now a fairly progressive version of the story, but not the whole story. So there's a really kind of, at least for me, exciting way to think about the echoes of the past in the present, and to think about the ways of doing history as a way to kind of enact change and amplification.
That's great. And I also just want to say, those of you, you haven't heard Bonnie play, but she's a really wonderful musician. And when she talked about not instrumentalizing art, but just allowing art to speak and do what it can do, she really also does that. So if you get a chance, you can look her up on that internet and find the work she does musically, which is also, you know, engaged in a lot of the same kind of ways of working with people, connecting with people in a real time, real way. But also, I think there's something very always positive and hopeful in the work you do and the writing that you do and the way you live your life that's really encouraging to everybody who is trying to do this. So thanks very much for being here. I think we don't have any more questions. So I think what we'll do is, first of all, really thank the Tisch College as being such a good partner for this. Thank Sophia for the introduction, and really thank Bonnie for being here and doing this work and telling us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.